everybody, and welcome to the Legislative Budget Office Oversight Commission meeting. Today is Thursday, January 22nd, 2026. I am remote today because of the weather. We're having little ground blizzards here down in the south, so I can't tell who's in the room, and I can see who's remote. So maybe we can just have members introduce themselves. We'll start with those that are present.
Okay, I guess we'll start with the House. So Representative Dave Pinto from St. Paul, and good to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Representative Patty Anderson from Delwood, Washington County area.
And John Marty from the Senate, Roseville.
Melissa Wickland from the Senate and Bloomington Richfield, Minneapolis.
And Mr. Chair, I'll just note we have a House member who's at the table, not a member of the committee of the commission, but just want to acknowledge her presence, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This is Representative Carrie Ray Rower. Thanks for letting me sit in and listen.
Awesome. Well, and then those of us online, Senator Eric Pratt, Vice Chair. I'll be presiding until Representative Knorr attends. I represent Senate District 54, Scott County. I see Senator Dames online.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Chair Pratt. This is Senator Gary Dames, represents Senate District 15, which is...
And Representative Perriman.
Good afternoon. This is Representative Bernie Perriman from St. Cloud, Minnesota.
And did I miss anybody? It's hard to chair a committee from remote, so thank you all very much. We do have a quorum, and so we'll go ahead and move on. Members,
Mr. Chair,
you have, yes.
Apologies for interrupting. Because we have folks in the room and on Zoom, we do need actual official roll call attendance.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Ms. Schnabel, will you take the roll?
Representative Knorr. Senator Pratt.
Here.
Pratt present. Representative Anderson.
Here.
Anderson present. Senator Dames.
Present.
Dames present. Senator Marty.
Present.
Marty present. Representative Perryman.
Present.
Perryman present. Representative Pinto.
Present.
Pinto present. Senator Wickland. Wickland present. Representative Knorr. Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. Members, we have in front of you the meetings from the last minute, or the meeting minutes from our last meeting on December 17th, 2025. I just want to know if there are any corrections, or is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Mr. Chair, I'll move approval.
Thank you. If there's no other discussion, all those in favor of adopting the minutes signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? That motion carries. One second here. Members, we have a presentation. The next order of business is the presentation from Erica McKellar from the National Conference of State Legislatures discussing dynamic scoring. We had quite a discussion last meeting and kicking this off. So, Ms. McKellar, are you at the testifiers table?
Yes, just getting the presentation all set up.
Excellent. Ms. McKellar, welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and feel free to begin when you're ready.
Great. I am Erica McKellar, and I'm with the National Conference of State Legislatures. And can everyone hear me okay? Great. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Mr. Vice Chairman and members of the committee for having me here today. I'm Erica McKellar, and I'm with the Fiscal Affairs Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today to talk about dynamic fiscal notes, dynamic scoring, dynamic analysis, however you kind of want to refer to that. The information that I plan to share with you today comes from studies conducted by state legislatures over the years, a study from Georgia State University, and my conversations with legislative fiscal staff in the states, including a few examples that I'll share. Just to kick things off, kind of the key takeaways or goals of my presentation today are just to talk a little bit about the difference between static and dynamic fiscal notes, the history of dynamic fiscal notes and some state experiences, and the dynamic fiscal note process in Texas, Utah, and Arkansas, and then discuss a few challenges and considerations for producing dynamic fiscal notes. I won't spend too much time talking about what's involved in static fiscal notes because I know you all are very familiar, but I thought it would be kind of helpful to set the stage before we kind of talk about what makes dynamic analysis so different. Every state except Hawaii produces fiscal notes, though it varies whether they're produced by the executive branch, the legislative branch, or a handful of states have kind of a hybrid approach. They typically lay out the expected direct revenue and expenditure changes for state governments within a 1 to 5 year period. Most commonly, states estimate out about 1 to 3 years in fiscal notes, but a few do look out about 5 years. The legislation that requires fiscal notes varies greatly by state. In many, every bill will receive a fiscal note, and in some, there might be a monetary threshold associated with that, or in some states, they must be requested by a chair, by leadership, or some specific type of member. While the direct revenues and costs to states are kind of the most common fundamental part of fiscal notes, some states also include other types of analysis with them, such as the cost to local governments, the private sector, or demographic impact statements. And some states, like I think you do here in Minnesota, produce some of those separately from the fiscal note, but are kind of like looked at in tandem. So that's just a brief kind of setting of the stage of static fiscal notes in the states. So dynamic fiscal notes or dynamic analysis attempts to quantify the downstream effects of policy changes throughout the economy. In the states that have experimented with dynamic analysis, this has most often been done related to tax bills. So changes in a tax rate or creating a tax credit, some different things like that. In some cases, the analysis might be done just to better understand the effects that these changes will have on the economy. And in other cases, it might be to see if the economic activity generated by the change is enough to offset lost revenue to the states or vice versa. An example from a study of fiscal notes in Colorado discusses how legislation to expand a personal income tax credit will result in lower liability for affected taxpayers, and that may in turn cause people to spend more money on goods and services, and businesses that receive that increased revenue will then pay more to the state in corporate tax revenue, and they may invest in new research and technologies and hire more workers, and as they hire more workers, it may cause the labor market to tighten, leading to higher wages. And the example goes on to say that expanding the tax credit will also reduce the revenue to the state, which could result in a loss of economic development. And the revenue decreases the funds available to the state to be spent on other government services. So recipients may receive less and may or may not be offset by the benefits they might receive by the expanded tax credit. So all of that convoluted example is really just to illustrate that dynamic modeling attempts to take all of these different cumulative downstream trade-offs kind of into account. According to the study from Georgia State University, at least 21 states have experimented with some sort of dynamic scoring. A lot of this occurred between the mid-1990s and the mid-2010s. And most states purchased modeling software licenses from the Regional Economic Modeling Incorporated, better known as REMI. And 3 states kind of built their own modeling software. According to the study, Massachusetts was one of the first states to use REMI to model the dynamic effects of tax proposals between 1993 and 1995, but the effort was largely abandoned after the model showed revenue estimates that were below the static estimates. So, California built their modeling system in 1994 in response to legislation that required them to produce dynamic fiscal notes, and then Oregon and Nebraska kind of took that model and adapted it for their needs as well. But in California, the law sunset after 5 years, and they largely phased out that model. So these are just sort of a couple of historical examples, but overall, states that have experimented with dynamic analysis have kind of largely kind of abandoned those efforts for reasons that we'll discuss a little bit later.
Mr. Chair.
So I want to briefly go
Chair.
through some key elements of the process in 3 states that do still in practice or in
Excuse me.
theory. Excuse me.
I'm sorry, we had, it sounded like Senator Marty had a quick
Yes,
question.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Yes, I am having a little trouble hearing. You speak very fast and you're saying lots of important stuff, so a little bit louder, maybe a little bit slower. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely. Would you like me to go back at all, or just?
Excuse me, the 21 states using the REMI modeling, from that point on, I was having trouble hearing.
Okay. I think largely my point there was that REMI has historically been the software that states have used to do this type of modeling. But a lot of states that have experimented with dynamic scoring have done it for a few years, and then it sort of have phased it out or have kind of abandoned those efforts. So I wanted to talk about 3 states who still, in practice or in theory, do produce dynamic fiscal notes. And I spent some time talking with economists in Texas, Utah, and Arkansas, which all maintain the ability to produce these fiscal notes. And the first state that I wanted to take a quick look at is Texas, where the Legislative Budget Board, or the LBB, which is the nonpartisan central fiscal office of the legislature, can produce dynamic fiscal notes. And there are 2 processes by which they might do this type of analysis. The first is that in 2009, the legislature passed a bill that created a provision within the Texas Code to require the LBB to produce a dynamic fiscal impact statement on any tax or fee measure where the static fiscal note estimated an increase or decrease the state revenue of $75 million annually. And the analysis is required to project those estimates 5 years out. The Legislative Budget Board already had a more basic REMI license, but they upgraded their license version to allow for this type of analysis. And the first couple of sessions after this code was enacted, the LBB did do some of this type of analysis at the request of Ways and Means Committee chairs, but they haven't really been asked to complete this type of analysis in quite some time. They estimate in about 12 or 13 years, they haven't really been asked to do this. And for a little more context, Texas meets every 2 years. The LBB kind of talks with the committee chairs so that they're aware this type of analysis can be produced, but they've just declined to have that analysis done. And there may be a variety of reasons that they have not produced this analysis, but one is that the results haven't always shown what legislators have been anticipating. The second process where the Legislative Budget Board produces dynamic fiscal notes is for the biennial appropriations bill. And this is a requirement that was put in place in 2011, which was the first session that Texas had to really make some pretty significant budget cuts after the Great Recession. So it was designed to show kind of the downstream effect of those cuts. And the Legislative Budget Board still consistently produces the analysis, a dynamic fiscal note for each appropriations bill, although the downstream effects have been more muted in recent years with kind of the stable fiscal conditions of the state. And they still maintain their REMI license and use REMI software for this type of analysis. Dynamic impact statements have also been produced in the past by economists from the Central Nonpartisan Office of the Legislative Fiscal Analyst in Utah. And Utah is a little different than Texas in that there's never been a requirement for the office to produce this type of analysis, but there started to be a lot of interest in it in the mid to 2010s, and legislators started kind of asking for this type of analysis, and the office decided to try to do it just to sort of accommodate that need and that interest. They don't limit the type of analysis to any sort of threshold, but as kind of mentioned in the Georgia State study and other studies, the analysis tends to be more meaningful for large budget items. Utah is also different in that they will only complete this type of analysis in the interim, so it's more of kind of a supplemental analysis after the fact. The reason for that is that, legislative sessions are short and staff time is limited. And these bills, or this type of analysis can take a lot of staff time and resources. So they will do this type of analysis at the request of any legislator, but only during the interim and kind of as staff time and resources allow. When there was a lot of interest in this type of analysis, they estimate they would be asked to produce about 2 or 3 of this type of analysis a year. But interest in the past few years has sort of waned, and they haven't been asked to perform an analysis in about 6 years. From a software perspective, they used to use REMI, but they switched to IMPLAN a few years ago for cost reasons. And if you're interested in kind of the differences between these 2 software models, I'd be happy to follow up with some resources on that. But not being a tech person, I'm not familiar with all of the ins and outs of those. I wanted to include Arkansas in this discussion because unlike Texas and Utah, who have the capacity to do dynamic analysis but haven't really been asked to do it in a while, Arkansas just began producing dynamic fiscal notes last year. Ahead of the session, the legislature put procedures in place to decide how to govern that and how the process would work. To start, my understanding is that in Arkansas, sometimes the executive branch produces the static fiscal note, and sometimes the Fiscal Services Division of the Bureau of Legislative Research, so their central nonpartisan staff, will prepare that note. But the dynamic analysis is only done by the Fiscal Services Division. They use Texas kind of as a model for their rules and procedures. And it's mostly designed for tax and fee bills is what it's been used for so far. And like Texas, they have a threshold associated with it. So if a static model shows an impact to state revenues over $1 million, it's eligible for this dynamic analysis. In Arkansas, only the Speaker of the House or the Senate President can request a dynamic analysis, and they're each limited to 5 per session. And last year, economists conducted dynamic analysis on 5 total pieces of legislation. And so far, they are sort of mirroring the static estimates and only going 2 years out so that they're easily comparable. Last session, they prepared 5 dynamic analysis, and they were tied to relatively low levels of funding, so the results were not dramatically different from their static estimates. And like Texas and some others, they also use REMI software. So to kind of wrap up, I just wanted to talk a little about some of the considerations around doing dynamic scoring. Over the years, many states have experimented with it, but after time, most either kind of abandon the effort, interest has sort of faded. There may be many reasons for that depending on the state, but I just wanted to kind of go through a few that I think have come up in multiple studies and in my conversation with legislative fiscal offices. And the first, I've kind of touched on this, is just staff time and resources. Gathering the information and producing these notes can take a lot of staff time, and legislative sessions are short, so many states choose not to undertake this type of analysis just to prioritize staff time and resources elsewhere. Points 2 and 3, kind of staff expertise and assumptions that go into these models. Everyone I spoke with who's been involved in this type of analysis has pretty extensive experience with the software programs that they're using. And I think that is critical to kind of ensuring the reliability of analysis because it often requires staff to decide what those assumptions going into those models are. And the final output is really only as good as the inputs that are going into it. And staff mentioned that there are kind of hundreds of assumptions that can go into these models, and tweaking just a few, can drastically change the results. So I think kind of being familiar with the software and what's going into it is helpful. I also think staff expertise can be important in explaining kind of what the results of this type of analysis means, because otherwise you're just sort of looking at a big jumble of numbers. And one other sort of consideration around the software piece is that the licenses can be very expensive. So just sort of weighing the costs and benefits of purchasing those licenses. Another point is, or one of the reasons that staff speculate that interest in this sort of wanes is, and this also comes up in the Georgia State study, is that sometimes the dynamic effects are smaller than anticipated. So there's not a great deal of difference between the static and the dynamic modeling. And one other kind of related point here is that states will sometimes partner with universities to conduct this type of analysis. There's often consultants and other industry groups that do this type of analysis as well, and their results may be different than what nonpartisan staff come up with. So there is, this dynamic analysis is out there from other groups as well. It can be difficult to determine the accuracy, I think, of dynamic analysis. Even if you say 5 or 10 years down the road, we're going to revisit what we thought was going to happen. A lot of other things can happen within that same time period. So just isolating that policy change variable can be a challenge in just sort of determining the accuracy later on. And finally, just from like a practical standpoint, balanced budget requirements can kind of make this analysis difficult. A dynamic analysis may show certain effects 5 or 10 years down the road, but you all are operating under a balanced budget requirement and ultimately have to balance your spending and revenues, for the upcoming annual or biennial budget. So the ability to kind of weigh some of those downstream effects could be impacted by, fiscal restraints and fiscal conditions on the ground. So those are a few of the reasons that I think it's cited for why sometimes interest in this has waned that I just wanted to go through. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you, Ms. McKellar. I appreciate that. Do we have any questions from members?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is very interesting. I guess it sounds like most of the states have done it basically on tax bills, which I would picture having everybody, I've heard this for decades, you cut this tax and people are going to use a lot more, so we'll generate more revenue, or we're going to whatever. And I understand that, and I think the nature of this is the challenge of doing it well. But wasn't looking at the tax side, but I hear from a number of folks, especially in Health and Human Services area, about the importance, why this would be helpful. And I asked one of the members who has done that, who had a bill last year, which actually passed, but I don't know that in terms of measuring the accuracy even after the fact is hard, as I'm sure it is with tax and everything else. But the illustration was Senator May Quaid had a bill this past year, and I'm not on the committee, and the chair is next to me, so she may have other thoughts on this. But she was saying that her bill was to provide medical assistance for in-home use of blue light therapy lights for newborns with anemia kind of thing, I guess it was, and with jaundice. And she got a fiscal note, came out to be, when you take out the federal side, the state share was about $9,000 a year, tiny amount. So when you're talking about the results being small, this is a tiny measure. But in this case, they calculated the cost of providing the therapy at home. It was a fixed thing from the fiscal note, $525 for rental and setup. I guess the operating costs are minimal electricity use. And 34 of them in a year, they thought that would all be fairly standard. I'm not quibbling with anything in the fiscal note on that. But her point is, if it's a covered medical assistance, covered Medicaid benefit, and you have a newborn with jaundice, and you're in the hospital, and you can go home now, but we want the baby under this blue lights for a few days, we send you home at $525 for a week or 2 weeks of the therapy versus 4 more days in the hospital. She was arguing that almost every case, the child is going to get the therapy, but if they're for getting it home, they're going to get it at a very much more expensive hospital. and wonders why something like that might show instead of savings. And of course, the dynamics change in many ways. If it's covered at home, there are going to be a lot more people getting it at home. So the cost is probably higher, but the cost savings are probably higher too. And I think, talking with Senator McQuaid, I think I share her belief that in some cases, this would make it more accurate and more helpful to the legislature in making decisions, though I think we would both agree with, I think, what fiscal staff and the LBO staff and everybody would say is got to use extreme caution because your measures, it's staff and time intensive, the assumptions required, though everything in our fiscal notes, including this fiscal note, has assumptions, and they're not always the best assumptions, but we have to live with that. Difficulty to measure accuracy. And so I just wondered your comment on the fact that some cases, not that, oh, if we spend money on this, it's going to reduce the need for this and it's going to do that. But in a case where the patient is going to get care in this setting or that setting, and that setting's much more, I think some of our human services folks feel they would be making much different choices if they could count some of that scoring. And so I just wondered your comments on that. And I guess not just for the witness, but from others on the BOOC or administration or legislative staff, I guess I'd welcome feedback, but I'm wondering about your comments on that.
Sure.
Ms. McKellar.
Sorry. Yes, thank you.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I think that this type of analysis definitely can be useful. The sort of takeaway that I was hoping for my presentation is just things to consider if you choose to go down this route, just to think about the way that you are setting it up. What type of limitations, if any, do you want to put on the legislation that you may want to use this type of analysis for? So I think that your example could be a very good one to use this type of analysis on if that's, what the committee decides to ultimately pursue.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Marty.
could I ask LBO and MMB and Senate fiscal staff for brief comments on, I know I every time I mention this, I hear pushback, understandably, because of the risk, the difficulty of doing it, but I guess I wonder if you have any comments on any of this in that particular case, which is, again, I tried to pick one that looked to me to be fairly clear and very minimal. I mean, saying that something that costs $9,000 a year, $18,000 biennium is, may have offsetting things, maybe a savings. In a case like that, a budget chair may say, hey, if this saves, if it's costing $9,000 or if it expands because 5 times as many people get the treatment at home, maybe it's saving hundreds of thousands, and instead of a 5 times as high of a fiscal note, maybe it would be 10 times as much savings. So I just wonder if anybody wants to comment. I want to have brief discussion. I know the chair has other things on the agenda, but just would love to hear comments.
Mr. Larson, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think in the kind of the example provided, I think the question is that might even fit in within what we would consider a direct impact, right? Like in terms of just because something has savings doesn't inherently mean that's not a direct impact, as opposed to maybe more dynamic scoring, which is really sometimes looking at behavior change, but really it's acting more like, is there changes in the larger economy? Is there some other changes that may exist? I think in terms of fiscal notes on these type of programs and HHS interventions in particular, it really comes down to how confident are we in the realization, how fast it might take place. Those are really challenging things to nail down, and it puts the state at a lot of risk if we don't have it right. I think those in this particular case, I wouldn't inherently say that wouldn't necessarily be a dynamic analysis so much as what is the confidence level that this will result in this type of outcome. I don't know, perhaps Ms. Mingy might want to speak to that too, but that's, I think, from the Legislative Budget Office, how we would consider that.
Ms. Bingy, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I agree with a lot of what Mr. Larson has shared. I don't think that the impacts that you just described, Senator Marty, are inherently dynamic when we think about impacts that are to the broader economy or outside of a program area. I think a lot about, in some of these things, there's like a substitutional effect. If someone is receiving a service at home, then it is unlikely they're also receiving in another setting. But the challenge comes with what is the data that's available to make those estimates, and are the studies on this sort of consistent, and are they available to the folks completing the fiscal note? So I think it's certainly something, I know it's something the agency considers, and sometimes there are factors like that that are incorporated in fiscal notes. But I'm grateful that Mr. Larson noted that we have to be mindful that if we are tracking a savings, that means that we are appropriating less money for the program, and so we could be directly affecting the sufficiency of that appropriation if it doesn't materialize the way we think, or if implementation is delayed. And so it's just something for you all to keep in mind.
If I could, Senator Marty, I don't mean to interrupt, but if I could maybe just tag along with your question. To that point, let's say we're to make a cut at the state level, and it were to impact school district, county, a city, would the dynamic scoring pick that up? So are any of the other states, are they considering other local government impacts that we're picking up in a local impact note that might be picked up in a dynamic scoring model?
That is a good question that I can't say for certain. I would expect that they would take into account, the downstream effects on local governments, depending on the type of legislation. But I can do a little more research on that and get back to you if that would be helpful.
Sorry to jump in front of you, Senator Marty. Did you have any other?
No, Mr. Chair, I think this is a helpful discussion, and I take on this one illustration I brought, which is a small, but I think good one, that one, I'm being told it might not be what we call dynamic scoring because it's internal in the program and it's a substitution thing. As one who's seen many times what I think some colleagues would call death by fiscal note, where an agency or somebody, in this case, I don't know that the agency didn't want to do this, but in some cases, an agency may not want something. They do fiscal notes that I think are arguably way out of bounds. And there are disagreements on all this because everything here is assumptions. In a case like this one, it's not a delayed impact. It's kind of, if child is getting the treatment at home, they're not getting it at the hospital, so it'd be immediate. In any case, I just wanted the discussion, and I hope we continue this, and I appreciate the commission beginning to take a look at this, and I guess it's not shocking to me, but it's interesting that so few states have looked at it, and they basically looked at it on revenue bills instead of appropriations bills. So, okay, that's all I had, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from members?
Mr. Chair, Representative Pinto here.
Representative Pinto, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I had a couple things I'm trying to think through. So I guess one question is, am I right? I'm not sure if this is the testifier, or maybe some of our experts are on the table, but I guess our current fiscal notes are dynamic in the sense that within the time horizon and within the budget area, I think it's the case that if a fiscal note that shows an expenditure in year one, if it would generate savings in that budget area in the following couple years, sometimes I feel like I've seen that. And just curious if I'm correct about that. Not sure to our LBOC. Just trying to sort of get my head around that concept. Looks like maybe Mr. Larson, Mr. Chair, is getting ready to respond.
Mr. Larson.
Senator Pratt and Representative Pinto. So the current fiscal process doesn't inherently not allow for a savings to occur so long as Ms. Mingy suggested, it's within the realm of the program, and you're saying it's really a first, maybe kind of a second order or impact of that. Those are kind of gray terms, and we don't have a perfect definition of those things. But generally, can we say it's a first order impact within the realm? Like, if this happens, this is a likely behavior change, so long as we can really quantify that or in our case, if so long in the Minnesota case of fiscal notes, the agency can quantify and the LBO can validate that, that's the most likely outcome, and that we have a strong level of confidence of that. And so that the fiscal notes can inherently have that within the fiscal note, as you were stating.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, may I continue?
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. Because I've long been interested in the concept of, there's a concept called social benefit financing. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with this. It has some different terms, but basically recognizing that I've got a particular interest, I think as many folks are aware, in children and families issues. And, you make an investment. We know this in K-12, right? And there's a reason that we decide as a society that we're going to invest in public education, because it does pay off to have children learn to read, for example. We have a big payoff to that. We've just decided as a society to invest in that particular thing. We don't do dynamic scoring on K-12. We just recognize that it's going to pay off. And so in my early years here in the legislature, I was looking a lot at that concept to say, well, are there places where we know if we invest early in like infant health, for example, it's going to pay off in future years? Not in the next couple years necessarily, but if you look longer enough away. And so I guess, Mr. Larson, to what you were saying, it seems like the constraints here, the dials that could be turned compared to what we do now and compared to what either some other states do or what even going beyond those other states, is there's a restriction on, are you looking just in the one budget area? So if I spend money in, I don't know, in one budget area and there's a savings the following year in a different budget area, our current system does not capture that. It's exactly the same thing. It just happens to be in a different agency. So we've got that constraint. We've got the first order, second order, third order. Of course, the more orders you get to, the less certainty we have, or potentially less accurate. And there's also the time horizon. It seems like those are the three pivots that I can see, or the three sort of dials to turn, so to speak, compared to what we do now. Because we do dynamic scoring, actually. Dynamic scoring, it's just we do it only first or second order, only in the budget area, and only in the following couple years. There are challenges with any of those dials. It seems like other states have found a lot of concerns with it. I'll note it seems like sometimes they're focused more on tax cuts possibly than investments in children and families. I'm looking at Chair Wickland over there. So I'm not necessarily sort of arguing for anything in particular, but just kind of note that. I'm not sure if the testifier has any comment on what I'm describing. I'm just trying to get my own head around this. That very often, I'll just say this before turning to you, testifier, that so very often we are making investments or choosing not to make investments because we're worrying about the pennies and not worrying about the immediate penny and not the long-term pound. And we decided, 150 years ago that when it comes to public education, we're going to make that kind of investment. There's many other places where actually we're not doing it because if we did it in our budget, the savings are going to accrue some other time, some other place, even massive savings. And that ends up being, we end up not making good choices because of that. So just curious with your NCSL national perspective on any of that.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. McKellar. Yep.
I think, so in my conversations with folks, tax bills came up a lot as the example of the type of analysis that was being requested for this, but I think that is not limited specifically only to tax bills. I think, there all of these other health and human service bills, transportation bills could also, be subject to dynamic scoring. I do, to Mr. Larson's point, I think it is common for states to include behavioral changes in fiscal notes when there's a high level of certainty around the research and analysis that is out there, which does, I feel like it has some elements of dynamic scoring. And I think health and human service bills are an area where, there could be some research that may inform those fiscal notes.
And then a final item, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
Thank you. so I'll just say, as I've looked into this concept of social benefit financing, of saying you kind of take the savings you generate in future years and use them to actually make the investment now. I mean, businesses do that all the time, right? And government doesn't as much. It's incredibly complicated and challenging. And there's a reason it's doesn't have to be concerned. I'm going to be like proposing that tomorrow because I've been looking at it for a long time. But if folks are interested in talking about that separately, love to do so because, again, private sector does that all the time. It's just we're not set up to do it in the public. But maybe a question for you, Mr. Chair, for somebody. Representative Anderson and I were wondering what sort of led this to be on the agenda. We were just sort of curious. It's an important, interesting topic, but was wondering whether there's something in particular that prompted it to be on our agenda today. And that's all. Thank you. Anybody know?
I think Chair Knorr could speak to that better, but, last time we had a presentation on fiscal notes and local impact notes, and the concept of dynamic scoring came up in that conversation and something we wanted to know more about.
Well, appreciate us doing that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. McKellar, you mentioned that some states have abandoned this process because of the time and complexity. Can you give me a sense of how much effort this has been taking in most states? So we usually get a fiscal note turned around within a couple of weeks, sometimes within a couple of hours. What is the commitment from the staff and the agencies to do this dynamic scoring?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I did try to get a sense of, how long these would take, and it definitely seems like it is very dependent on the type of legislation that is being requested for. For Utah, which does them in the interim, they said usually within like a couple of weeks that they try to turn this analysis around. And Arkansas, I know, they just started doing them and they are doing them during session. So they also, I think we're trying to get them done within a week or two. So that's my best understanding, but unfortunately I don't have a very clear picture of that, in part, I think, because they haven't been doing them as often lately, so.
And I see Chair Knorr is here, so I'll turn the gavel over to him. But Chair Knorr, I have another question, if it's okay with you.
Go ahead, Senator Pratt.
Thank you. When we talk about dynamic scoring in the private sector, or I've used some of it. I know financial advisors are using similar types of software. Are there, and you mentioned that assumptions are key to the output. Are there levels of confidence? Are there usually different, if inflation is 5% instead of 3%, if, thinking of a financial advisor, if the rate of return on stocks is 8% instead of 6%, changes the outcome. Do you have that type of flexibility? Do you have those scenario that come as part of the software package?
Mr. Chair?
Ms. McKenna, go ahead.
I believe that REMI, at least some specific licenses, do allow for different scenarios. I don't think InPlan, which is the other software that some states use, does do that. But there are softwares available that, yes, you can do different scenarios and get different results.
Mr. Chair, I've had the opportunity to do some of this in the private sector, and I think it's a really powerful tool and something I hope we'll consider as a committee.
Thank you, Vice Chair Pratt, and I will go to Representative Anderson.
Thank you. I'll just be brief. Thank you for doing this, so we actually, understand what we're talking about, for having the presentation. I appreciate it. I think it's pretty clear to me that doing something like this is, if we ever, whether it's taxes issues or human service or whatever, everything is assumptions. And for example, the issues, Representative Pinto was talking about, well, there's other people with different political stripes might make the same argument that actually would have a totally different effect on something. And so that's what the legislative process is about, is we all want to do good, and we think that if we do this, that it's going to have, you know, these positive effects. And, but as we know, none of us are right totally. And so certainly putting a process in like this would put that on you as our staff, you know, saying, hey, you make those very, you know, those assumptions that are, you know, probably not going to be accurate at all. So I think it's a good exercise. I can understand why states don't do this, even in the tax realm, which, you know, I'm on the tax committee, and I would say if you do this, you'd get this, but actually other people on the other side of the aisle would say, no, you get the opposite, you know, effect. So I get it. So I'm not, I'm happy that we looked at it. I'm not in favor of going down this really rabbit hole, so thanks.
Any other member discussion? Just a quick question. Is this dynamic scoring or budgeting used in the federal fiscal process? I don't know. I missed, I'm sorry, I missed some of the beginning. I had an emergency meeting to go to.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I believe the Congressional Budget Office does dynamic scoring.
And how has that been effective in terms of determining? Has it been broadly be used or specific items within the federal government?
I'm not totally familiar with the inner workings of the CBO, so I'm not entirely sure on that, but I could do some research if that would be helpful.
I appreciate it. If we can get some information, because that will be a good reference to see how the federal government implements the dynamic scoring. And so I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know if Director Lassen wanted to add anything.
Chair Noor, just to let the commission know, in knowing that this conversation was coming up, we did reach out to a contact at the CBO just to talk, and so we had a brief conversation about how they're handling their dynamic scoring. We talked to folks from their kind of static scoring team and their dynamic scoring team, and we can compile some information, provide that, or perhaps at a future commission meeting we can develop a presentation which might be useful.
Thank you so much, Director Lassen. Thank you so much, Ms. McKell, for the presentation. I'm sure everybody had a chance to dig, deep, and we'll continue this conversation and see how that can be, useful to the state budgeting process. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time.
So we'll move to the next agenda item, which is the local impact notes. Director Lassen, do we have the individuals on this?
Chair Noor, so there is some written testimony from the League of Minnesota Cities and Association of Minnesota Counties in your packets. You certainly can read through that. We have representation here from the League of Minnesota Cities if you have any questions for them. We also have folks here from the Minnesota Association of School Board Officers and the Minnesota School Board Association, which I believe the Minnesota School Board Association does have some testimony they'd like to come and provide, and so whatever order you'd like to take that.
If anybody's here just to testify on this, please come forward. Please state your name and proceed with your testimony on this topic, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Kim Lewis, and I'm representing the Minnesota School Boards Association. MSBA represents all 331 locally elected school boards across Minnesota. So that takes into effect urban, suburban, and rural school districts. And those are the folks that that's the state policy that you make into real services for students and families. This conversation is very timely, and I was just talking with my colleague. I know fiscal notes has been a part of your discussion, the last meeting and this meeting, and local impact notes. Last month, our delegate assembly got together and passed a resolution calling for a clearer process when legislation creates new mandates on school districts. They wanted it to include a full fiscal note, local impact note, and a dedicated sustainable funding source, and also when the mandate is effective to have some flexibility in there so they can prepare, because we are obligated to be a balanced budget. The problem is very simple. Legislation often imposes requirements without accurate cost impacts or estimates or the funding to support them. Districts are expected to absorb these new responsibilities using resources that are already committed to instruction and student services. When legislative mandates pass without reliable funding, they become unfunded obligations and displace classroom support, mental health services, and transportation. This undermines local control, strains budgets, and ultimately shifts costs to taxpayers. Beyond the fiscal impact, when the actual costs of mandates exceed legislative promises, local school boards often pay the price in lost public confidence. We've seen what happens when the system fails in this regard. Paid leave is an example for school districts, and it was a moving target for us. It was very unclear, the financial assumptions, and the guidance was shifted in that process that we went through. And districts are still left trying to plan staffing and payroll without reliable information. That's not how major policy should be implemented in our eyes. We are here to offer a solution. We propose that LBO provide an initial local impact summary early in the process. This would provide a fast, early signal to legislators about where impacts may lie. It could mirror the Department of Revenue's process, a short description of intent, followed by a section-by-section analysis, a simple checklist with benchmarks, if you will, operational, staffing, fiscal, and workforce implications. And that would allow legislators to see the consequences of a bill at a glance. As we think about improving the process, we urge you to ground some changes in 4 guiding principles. Local impact information must be available by the first committee hearing so legislators know what they're voting on. When a bill requires a fiscal note or a local impact note, it should also trigger that local impact review as needed. We must ask ourselves, is this a new mandate? We looked at last year's legislation, and there were 85 new mandates imposed on school districts. If it is a mandate, how is it to be funded? And not just this year, but over the next 5 to 10 years. We must account for more than just dollars too. Workforce availability, substitute costs, and administrative capacity all matter in this regard. Consider summer unemployment for non-licensed staff. Districts were told that few staff would use it, and the initial funding would last significantly longer than it did. The fund was depleted within the first 3 years, requiring new resources to fulfill obligations. Our goal is to avoid repeating the challenges of 2023 and 2024, where major mandates passed without accurate impact information, forcing districts to cut programs and staff to absorb costs. Good policy depends on good information. School boards are ready to be partners in building a system that is clearer and more honest about consequences. We really thank you for inviting the voice of local government into this conversation, and I'm happy to stand for any questions that I'm able to answer.
Oh, Tina, please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Hi, my name is Tina Burkholder. I am the Director of Business Services at Monticello Public Schools and a member of the Minnesota Association of School Business Officials. School districts are expected to quickly assess the fiscal impacts of proposed legislation and explain those impacts to school boards, staff, and local community members. That responsibility requires more than high-level estimates. It requires clear and shared understanding of how a bill is intended to function financially. One of the biggest challenges school districts face is not simply estimating costs, it is interpreting legislative intent. When the intent is unclear, districts may model impacts differently, leading to inconsistent information, confusion, and difficulty planning responsibly. In reviewing the 4 alternatives presented in December, I would like to suggest an expansion of the cross-section analysis approach that was under consideration. I'm specifically proposing incorporating a structure fiscal clarification step that includes convening a small representative group of school finance officials reflecting different sizes and regions of the state, providing an opportunity for this group to meet with the Minnesota Department of Education, the finance staff, and the legislative staff or the bill author, and focusing the discussion not on advocacy or negotiation, but on clarification, developing a shared understanding of legislative intent, key assumptions, and how the proposed legislation is expected to operate in practice. This expanded cross-section approach would allow districts to ask informed technical questions early in the process before fiscal estimates are widely circulated. It would also help identify areas where impacts may vary significantly across the district or where unintended consequences may arise. A recent example of unintended consequences can be seen with the Minnesota Free School Meals program. While the goal of increasing access was achieved, participation increased more than anticipated. At the same time, fewer families completed income eligibility forms, which shifted more meal program costs to the state rather to the federal government. These impacts weren't fully understood until implementation. So in closing, school districts as well as other local governments are responsible for protecting public dollars and clearly explaining financial decisions to their communities. That responsibility depends on accurate, consistent, and reliable information. Expanding that cross-section analysis to include early clarification would strengthen understanding and reduce those unintended consequences and support better decision-making for legislators and local governments alike. And just want to thank you for this opportunity today. I hope it was helpful for the committee's discussion and that it could be expanded and relatable to other agencies and local governments.
Thank you so much, Ms. Burkholder. Any member discussion on this topic of local or Vice Chair Pratt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll let either one of the testifiers react to this. I agree with you. I would like to, we've requested local impacts many times, and at our last meeting, we discussed the fact that, and I'm not blaming school districts, I'm just saying in general, when we do a local impact request, we maybe get a 30% response rate, and it's not timely for the decisions that we're making. Any thoughts on how we can work that process better?
Who wants to take that? Ms. Lewis?
I would like to defer to Tina or Ms. Burkholder, because I think that's where most of the questions go into the direct business officials and the financial obligations that they carry, but I can certainly add on after she's done.
Ms. Burkholder?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, in the legislative sessions in session, it is a busy time for school business officials with budgeting and staffing. If I know things are always going through the session quickly, but if there was an opportunity where there was some time to look at the information and being able to have a deadline for a couple of days to review it, I think we could have better responses.
Well, I think usually we leave a deadline out there for, several weeks, and
Okay.
we're still only getting a 30% response rate, across the board, right? Not just, not just you guys. As you listen to the dynamic scoring discussion, did that seem to kind of fit some of the did that satisfy some of the concerns that you have? And do you feel like you could have some input into what those, as we talked about the assumptions, could you have some input into what those assumptions might be?
Ms. Burkholder?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't quite hear where we'd be able to interact with that process, but it would be interesting to see those tax impacts or tax bills, kind of how it would shake for the current biennium and forward, and how it might, like, I can't remember who talked about if there's impacts across other agencies or departments.
Vice Chair Pratt?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other member questions? Ms. Lewis?
Mr. Chair, just to add on to what Ms. Burkholder said, I think the downstreaming was of most interest to us as well, looking at what possible effects could happen down the road. In the two examples I gave, we look at not only what's happening today, because our enrollment changes, staffing changes, everything changes year to year. So to look at what possible issues might happen downstream would be very impactful, I think, to our budgeting process.
Any further discussions on the local impact? I know this is really important, that we get things right, but sometimes assumptions that are made based on the information that we have, and that partnership is key. Sometimes I think people tend to, if you look at the assumptions that we got for the unemployment, it was even higher than what was happening. So at least there has to be a process whereby we can analyze. It's just an assumption. Whatever facts that we may have at that point will help us, not only for the legislative process, but for the agencies that are administering those programs, so that you can partner with them to have that clarity before we sign off on a bill. So it's not only one group; it has to be multi-entity, process for us to make sure that we can be able to support our local government, not only states but also federal changes that impact you, Chair Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure how we move ahead on this, but I think the current process is so slow and so on that it is often pretty much unusable, and I'm not sure. I mean, we've talked about whether, I see in the letter from the cities and counties about perhaps a sampling, example impacts kind of thing. I'm not sure if how you pick the sample and whether you can get those particular sample governments to respond quickly, but somehow or another, I just sort of have the sense that it might be more, some information as good as we can get would be better than what we have now in many cases. But I'm not sure what the answers, we've talked about this before, but I think we all agree we want to do a better job than we've got, and I'm not sure how.
Chair Marty, I think one of the goals that we can do is be more selective on specific legislative items that we can get more deep dive so that people are aware of, rather than just opening it to everything that may become a local impact. So at least having high priority bills that have impact on local level and put more efforts to it, and have that team to be able to provide, rather than being more open, at least as a starting point for us to start analyzing what's happening. I don't know if that can be achieved. Director Lesson.
Chair and members, so I think what was kind of discussed from the representative organizations being kind of a high-level look early, and then possibly a follow-up with a deeper dive similar to what we currently do is possible. I think always there's always a resource requirement in any of this, and so right now we get between 1 and 5 local impact note requests per session. Bigger ones tend to move into the interim. Ones where we have data available to us that the LBO can just pull and make the analysis. Usually we can turn those around within the session. I think something around the line of a kind of a brief on the topic, followed up with a full analysis, is something that's certainly reasonable, and something, if the commission is interested, we think the LBO could move in that direction. If this would become something that would become much more either as possibly suggested, like a requirement, if it hits one requirement, or if we know it's going to have a local impact, then this has to be made, that would have a substantial impact in resources in our office, and so that would need to be considered. If they would stay around the level that we currently have, 1 to 5, I think it's certainly reasonable within our current resource to be able to manage that. I think that would be something for the legislature to consider if these are going to become much more. If a local impact note is going to be much more the process, and on the scale of a fiscal note, there's certainly some resources required to meet that demand.
Any further discussion? Director Lesson.
I apologize, Chair. I guess one thing I could offer up in a future meeting is an example of what kind of a brief with a full follow-up would look like, so that members could see, okay, have a general concept of what that is, if that would be helpful. Otherwise, we certainly could move forward with that concept if that's just the preferred model.
I think we should receive that even in our email, so that we can review it and have some sense of what we can do, just to make sure we have got a comprehensive process. We don't want to open up right now for routine process and create more work for the LBO. That is my suggestion, and I think we can continue to collaborate with our partners at the local level to have an impact on this challenge. With that, I think we're moving to the public testimony. We have someone who has signed up. Josh Berg, welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record and continue with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Josh Berg, and I serve as the Director of Minnesota Services and Strategic Growth at Accessible Space, Inc., based here in St. Paul. I'm here to both thank you and express strong support for advancing Minnesota's exploration of the dynamic fiscal note process. Minnesota has long relied on traditional fiscal notes to guide policymaking and budget decisions, but Minnesota's own evaluations have shown that while these notes are often based on plausible assumptions, they frequently lack transparency, sometimes rely on incomplete or questionable estimates, and occasionally include errors or omissions. When assumptions and calculations are not clearly documented, it becomes difficult for legislators and the public to assess reliability. These concerns were clearly identified in the OLA's 2012 fiscal note report, which found inconsistent methods across agencies, limited documentation of assumptions, and delays that reduced the usefulness of fiscal notes for real-time legislative work. We don't have an accuracy problem because state agencies aren't working hard. We have an accuracy problem because static tools cannot measure dynamic realities. Dynamic fiscal notes offer a way to strengthen, not replace, our existing process. They surface assumptions, test sensitivity to key variables, and better capture real-world impacts that static notes routinely miss, especially, as noted, in health and human services, where downstream cost avoidance is often the core purpose of evidence-based interventions. Health and Human Services, as previously mentioned several times, is precisely the area where static notes miss the most and where dynamic analysis can provide the clearest value. The need for modernization is also more important today. Minnesota faces a projected structural deficit in the out years, with spending pressures expected to outpace the revenue growth. In this environment, relying on only short horizon, static estimates increases the risks of decisions that appear affordable in the near term but drive higher long-term costs. When revenues tighten, visibility into long-term impacts become not optional but essential. Dynamic analysis also addresses two of the biggest contributors to fiscal note errors: hidden assumptions and omitted impacts. Utah's experience with dynamic fiscal notes is instructive. Static estimates for major tax proposals diverged significantly once behavioral and economic feedback effects were incorporated. Not every bill requires this level of analysis, but the lesson is clear. Making assumptions explicit and testing scenarios can prevent both large overestimates and large underestimates. As Minnesota moves forward, I encourage a practical, evidence-based approach. Pilot dynamic fiscal notes in a small number of areas where the research is strong and outcomes are measurable. Two strong candidates include community care hubs and PACE legislation. Community care hubs have a national track record of improving care coordination and reducing avoidable hospitalization and utilization. PACE has decades of evidence demonstrating reduced hospitalization rates and lowering nursing home placement among high-need seniors. These are exactly the types of long-term, real-world effects that dynamic fiscal notes are built to quantify, showing not only what programs cost up front, but also what they prevent and what they save over time. These programs give Minnesota a safe, evidence-rich sandbox, strong data in, strong models out. Dynamic fiscal notes are not about replacing legislative judgment. They're about improving the information available to you, especially as we navigate structural budget pressures and seek strategies that bend the cost curve without sacrificing outcomes. Static notes try not to look ahead. Dynamic notes are designed to look ahead. I encourage the committee to move forward with developing a dynamic fiscal note pilot or continue the discussion, beginning in Health and Human Services and focused on proven, empirically grounded models. And before closing, Mr. Chair, I just want to briefly reiterate 2 points raised throughout the conversation today. First, the 21 states that experimented with dynamic budgeting, as mentioned, largely applied it to tax and economic legislation, areas with many variables and complex behavioral effects. And that is precisely why I recommend Minnesota start with empirically based programs and practices where evidence is strong, data are available, and models are meaningfully reflect reality. And then second, the OLA's 2012 report highlighted challenges with the static process that are still relevant today. A key question for this committee, and possibly for Auditor Randall, is whether the state has addressed those issues and how we currently track the accuracy of fiscal notes over time. Do we conduct any systemic lookbacks comparing projected versus actual spending once programs are implemented? Many of us can point to programs where fiscal notes significantly underestimated or overestimated costs. Understanding those gaps is essential if we want to improve the system moving forward. Thank you for your time, your leadership, and your commitment to this important discussion. I am confident that many of us, myself included, are very happy to support this work and just love the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bragg, for your testimony. We'll continue to have this conversation about dynamic scoring. So with no further agenda items at this time, we are now adjourned.